Hello. How great to see everybody here. Faces I recognize, old friends, new friends. It's wonderful to have you in this. I'm going to use the word that somebody said when they walked in. Magical room. This is really a magical room. Welcome to the Othmer Reading Room, the Othmer Library, of the Center for Brooklyn History, of the Brooklyn Public Library. I am Marcia Eli. I put together the programs here. And this is one of our fall series called Talks in the Othmer. This has been a series that's been happening for now almost 2 months. And we only have 2 more programs to go before we move back to a virtual set of programs while the downstairs is renovated and the building is closed. So it's really kind of very special to be in here tonight. Officially, this building is not open to the public, but we felt that before we closed for, whatever, until next spring, and when we have our grand reopening, we needed to do something very special in our most special space. So welcome and enjoy being in here, because it really is wonderful. Tonight we are journeying from rural Protestant of the Protestant Brooklyn of the 19th century to the ethnic mosaic it grew to become, and continues to be today. And as you probably all know, the book that has inspired this talk is titled Rise and Fall of Protestant Brooklyn, co-authored by Glenn C. Altschuler and Stuart M. Blumin. You probably saw as you came in that the book is downstairs. We are selling it. They are very happy to sign it. And at the end of the program, I want to invite you all to go down there and not linger up here, so that we can begin to form a line, and Professors Blumin and Altschuler can sit and sign books and talk to you more then. So that said, restrooms are out here. Other restrooms are upstairs. I'm going to go right ahead and tell you a little bit about who each of them are and turn it over to them. Glenn C. Altschuler is the Thomas and Dorothy Litwin Professor of American Studies at Cornell University. He is the author or co-author of 12 books, including All Shook Up, How Rock and Roll Changed America, and 2 previous books with Stuart Blumin, Rude Republic, Americans and Their Politics in the 19th Century, and the GI Bill, A New Deal for Veterans. And of course, I could say a lot more about both of these professors, but I'm going to cut it short so that you get to hear them. Stuart M. Blumin is Professor of American History Emeritus at Cornell University, the former director of the Cornell in Washington program, and a former fellow of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. He has authored or co-authored many books, including The Emergence of the Middle Class, The Urban Threshold, The Encompassing City, and now, and the 2 books that I mentioned that he co-authored, and now this third one that we're talking about tonight. So please help me greet them and welcome them up to the table. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Marcia. Can everyone hear me? Oh, that's a shame. We thought we'd start by telling you a little bit more about ourselves with some relevance to the rise and fall of Protestant Brooklyn. I was born in Brooklyn. I was born in Brownsville. I moved at least 4 times within Brownsville. And for the last 51 years, I've been at Cornell University, and I'm thinking of staying. I came to Cornell by way of Brooklyn because my father, believe it or not, worked in a shoe store in downtown Brooklyn called Cornell Shoes. So I knew fate was in store for me to go to Cornell. As Marcia said, this is the third book that Stuart Blumin and I have written, and as will indicate to you, it in many ways is the most personal book that we've written, even though the book stops in 1930. So, Stuart, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
There aren't any police here. All right. I was not born in Brooklyn. This is permitted. I was born in what I like to call the sixth borough. I was born and raised in Miami Beach. And being older than dirt, I can tell you that I entered school at the exact moment when people didn't need ration books anymore. And they could buy gasoline and rubber tires sufficient to get them from Brooklyn to Miami Beach. And so by the time I was in the second grade, I was surrounded by kids from Brooklyn who were all bigger than me and more sophisticated. We're talking about 7-year-olds, right? In Brooklyn, you can be sophisticated at 7 years old, not so much in Miami Beach. And so by necessity, that is in order to live until I got to the third grade, I became a very avid Brooklyn Dodger fan. And when I came to this building, I have to tell you, we started this book some few years ago, more than I want to admit. I entered, the main entrance there, and before I started up the staircase, there was a great big banner on the wall that I've just asked about again, which said, Brooklyn Dodgers 1955 World Series champions. And I was just thrilled, took a picture of it, and I just asked, why isn't that still there? Anyway, so one thing in a little more serious tone that may be relevant here is I've spent a good deal of my life trying to understand the history of American cities. I have one of my students from my urbanization course at Cornell here tonight. And yet I knew almost nothing about Brooklyn itself when this project was generated and I became a part of it. Is that something I think you want to talk about?
Yeah. So people often ask, why did you pick this subject for a book? And often the answer is pretty prosaic. In this case, a colleague of ours mentioned to us that Brooklyn was called, for much of its history, the city of churches. And we said, as one, I didn't know that. And we began to investigate this phenomenon. And the more we investigated, the more interested we became, the more we learned. And what we learned at the outset was that Brooklyn, for much of its history, was dominated by Protestants. And it's that story and the challenges that Protestants faced and resisted successfully for quite some time before giving way to what Marcia Eli has described as the cultural mosaic that is now Brooklyn. So the fact that it was Protestants is what ignited the study, but then we learned something that was equally surprising about who those Protestants were. Didn't we, Stuart?
Yeah, we did.
We did.
This is beginning to look rehearsed. I assure you this is not rehearsed.
Didn't we do that, Stuart?
Yeah, the remarkable thing, and some of you may know this, am I talking, is this thing working? Yeah, okay.
Oh, that's a shame.
I know, it can't be helped. We don't need it anyway. Glenn and I have been called voluble before. Anyway,
Talkers.
The remarkable thing in this Dutch-derived settlement is that it was not Dutch Protestants that we're talking about. It was not the descendants of the original Dutch settlers who settled the western end of Long Island, including Brooklyn. Brooklyn is originally a Dutch name, Brooklyn. It was New Englanders. So I see some of you nodding. It is known. It's not a discovery of ours. It was a discovery to us. But it was a fascinating thing to learn, and it energized the inquiry we made thereafter. Why New Englanders? The short answer to that is that New York was, of course, becoming the financial and commercial capital of the new United States. Very quickly after the Revolutionary era, Philadelphia and Boston had thrived at least as much as New York had, but New York really carried the prize. And if you wanted to make a buck, particularly if you were an ambitious entrepreneur in New England, whether it was Boston or Newburyport or Salem or wherever, you came to New York. This is where the money was to be made. And so a number of New Englanders came to work in Lower Manhattan, or what we call Wall Street today. And by the early 19th century, it was very natural for New York to expand its commercial operations and facilities and what have you across the river, the tidal strait, I'd rather call it. It's not a river. And they did so. Some of them moved across. And then there was this other area, the one we're sitting in right now, that high bluff that rises 70 feet or so above the river and goes for, I don't know how, a mile maybe, a long way, which the Lenape called Ipatonga. And the British, when they were in charge here for some few years, called Clover Hill, a fellow named Hezekiah Beers Pierpont, who moved here, bought a house. There were a couple of fancy houses already. He bought one called Four Chimneys. He had bought a distillery down on near the water. But he was still a Wall Street, or actually a Water Street merchant, established a little dock down by the river and rowed himself across the river, commuted by boat every day. Got the idea that this would be a nice place for gentlemen to come have their homes. And people like Ken Jackson, who you may know of, the historian of the American suburb, called this America's first suburb, Brooklyn Heights. A very different kind of expansion of the city, not a commercial expansion, but a residential expansion. And as it happens, most of the people who came across the river, including Pierpont himself, who was from New Haven and came from a family that founded Yale College. One of the daughters from the family married Jonathan Edwards. Pretty big stuff. He was from New Haven. The fellow who developed what is now Dumbo, and he wanted to call it the city of Olympia, became the commercial expansion of New York to this side of the river. He was, two brothers, Joshua and Comfort Sands. They were actually born on Long Island, but from a Puritan family, a family that stretched back to Puritan, Massachusetts. They virtually all did. It was almost impossible to find somebody who was part of this story who wasn't a New Englander. And so that made it a lot more interesting for us.
And so,
Glenn's going to shut me up.
why not? Well, that's a crude way of putting
That's what
it,
you're doing.
but that is what I intended, no question about that. So we then tried to understand what Protestant domination meant. And it's really the scale, the scope, and the fervency of that domination. These were New England Calvinists, and they meant for Brooklyn to be a New England Calvinist enclave. During the 19th century, that term city of churches in reality meant that per capita, Brooklyn had twice as many churches as Manhattan. And Manhattan became the Sodom across the river, and Manhattanites referred to Brooklyn with a sneer as that moral suburb. And the morality was enforced with some ferocity. What did it mean? It meant that a minister could give a sermon calling for religious toleration, and he would be criticized for 3 years for doing that. It meant that Brooklyn's signature event, a Sunday school parade, the biggest event in the United States of its kind, not only didn't have any Catholics, it had no Unitarians, it had no Universalists. It meant, Stuart, show me up here. It meant that Sabbatarians controlled or sought to control Brooklyn. It meant no theater in Brooklyn. It meant that there was a resistance against horse cars running on Sunday, even though people say, well, taking people to church. No. It meant that the Protestants controlled the discourse, controlled what was talked about and what was not talked about. And we can give you a little example of that.
Yeah. One of our most powerful sources was the local press. Both originally the Long Island and then Brooklyn Star, edited, by the way, by a fellow named Alden Spooner. The name Spooner is not familiar to you, perhaps, but the name Alden might ring a bell. Speak for yourself, John. Remember John Alden of Plymouth Colony, who was too embarrassed to propose marriage to Priscilla for his love, and so he had somebody else propose for him, and she said famously, "Speak for yourself, John." Well, Alden Spooner of Brooklyn is the direct descendant of John Alden of Plymouth. In his paper, I'm sorry, I forgot I had to do this, but you could hear me just as well without it, right? You know,
No,
I'm
we're
used
filming.
to
We're
bellowing.
filming.
I got paid for bellowing for many years.
We're
right?
filming, Bellow.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's right. Sorry, bellower, not Saul Bellow. I've lost my train of
Yes,
thought now.
so this
All right,
is
anyway,
what
in
was
the
said.
papers, and this comes from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which became the paper of record.
Which was not a principally Protestant newspaper.
In fact, it was run, although it was run for many years by an Irish immigrant, but he was Protestant.
But the paper appealed to
Yes, yeah.
Irish, German Catholics,
Yeah.
and others.
It was the Democratic paper, and hence it was where the Irish came home politically. And so what's interesting is in his paper, you might not expect to hear this kind of discourse. But in fact, in 1844, you read, and this is quite typical, and for no other reason but to just conduct this discourse. Here is a very short extract. That we in Brooklyn are a sober, moral, and religious people is manifest in everyone who has eyes to see with and makes use of them. The Holy Sabbath here is a proud day for the moralist and Christian, as they hold all around them the sure evidences of the triumph of their faith. Behold. And what other city of our numbers are seen so many tall spires pointing upward to the sky from the temples of the living God? You can't read more than a page or two of these papers without coming across that kind of discourse. Piety, particularly evangelical Protestant piety, was a necessity in public discourse in 19th century Brooklyn, and it lasted a very long time.
Yes, and so when the Brooklyn Academy of Music was built, the opposition to the Brooklyn Academy of Music was they're going to sneak in plays.
Yeah.
We don't want plays. We also should mention that Brooklyn was unusual in many respects, although you may notice that we subtitled the book An American Story, because we think that Brooklyn was both unique and representative. One of the things that was unique about Brooklyn is that it was at once a suburb and a city. It was also a huge place next to an even more dominant city. And many, many, many of the men worked in Manhattan, and as a journalist said in the 1870s, when they were asked where they were from, they said New York. They didn't say Brooklyn. And so for 6 days of the week, it was women who really lived in Brooklyn and were visible, and the men were in New York working. This isn't true of the working class Irish and others, but it's true of many, many of the professional people and some members of the working class.
And what this meant was that the institution of greatest interest to the men who were quite powerful in the formation of institutions, the institution that mattered to them was the institution they were part of and attended on the one day of the week they were in Brooklyn, which is the church. And it helps explain, is really the basic explanation as to why this was the city of churches, why there were so many churches, and for a number of years, not much else. I mean, there were other institutions, but compared to other growing American cities of this size, Brooklyn was institutionally fairly thin. When I mentioned, by the way, of this size, Brooklyn got a city charter in 1834 when it had, I think, about 25,000 people, which was actually not a small settlement in those days, but it wasn't huge either. By 1860, and I don't know if you remember my asking this question, and you didn't get it right, neither did I. Not one of my students got this right. I would ask, what was the third largest city in the United States in 1860? And the answer was Brooklyn, New York, right? And by a pretty wide margin. It was larger than Boston, New Orleans, and all the rest. By the end of the century, Chicago had caught it. It dropped it down to fourth. And by then, of course, by the very end of the century, it wasn't a city anymore. It was a borough in greater New York.
And so one of the things that, an important thing that we tried to do in the book was to document the domination of Protestantism and then to examine the challenges to Protestantism. Those challenges included some forces that were sweeping across the United States. Privatization. Many, many people were more interested in cultivating their homes. And in fact, Brooklyn tried to change its nickname to the City of Homes and Churches at one time. Commercialization, a very important phenomenon, very dangerous, the Protestants believed, with such places as Coney Island, where gambling was occurring, that people were seeking out prostitutes to some degree, where people were going on Sundays. You might be able to prohibit Sunday baseball, as the Protestants succeeded in doing for many, many decades, but you couldn't prohibit people from going to the beach if they wanted to. You couldn't prohibit people from playing golf if they want to, or going to Prospect Park if they want to. And in fact, the Protestants tried to prohibit ice skating on Sundays. Such was their interest in getting people to church. But of course, the principal challenge to the Protestants was the changing demography and two waves of immigrants. And maybe we should spend a few minutes talking about that challenge.
So you want me to do that, right? Yeah, of course, it's not a big surprise that Brooklyn was dominated by Protestants before the 1840s, let's say. There weren't very many other people who were not Protestants in America generally at that time. But of course, as you know, by the 1840s or so, especially with the the failure of the potato crops in Ireland, and with equal upheavals in Germany, a very large wave of new sorts of people came to the United States. Many of them came through New York Harbor. Some of those settled in Brooklyn. So Brooklyn acquired a pretty large Irish population. There had been some Irish Catholics here earlier. When Brooklyn started to become, when it was still, formally speaking, a village, before it got its city charter, unquestionably the most powerful institution in Brooklyn was the First Presbyterian Church on Cranberry Street, over there. In the same year that that church was founded, and that was a Puritan church, by the way, Connecticut Puritans became Presbyterians, where Massachusetts Puritans became Congregationalists. So we had the Presbyterian church, a couple of them, but that was the real powerhouse of Brooklyn. The same year that that church was founded, the first Roman Catholic church was founded in Brooklyn, in the city of Olympia, so-called, in the St. James, the same year. So there were Irish here in the 1790s, which is why Vinegar Hill is called Vinegar Hill. That was one of many losing battles that the Irish fought against the British. But there weren't very many. By the 1840s, there were very many. But they were almost entirely poor. They were, at first, not that significantly discriminated against, but anti-Catholicism, anti-Irish sentiment built into a very strong anti-Irish movement, from which the Germans were in large part exempted. The Germans came, generally speaking, with a little more resources. They weren't quite, they weren't relegated to the lowest rungs of the economic ladder when they got here. Probably about 2/3 of them were Protestants, although not that many of them were Calvinist Protestants. The German Lutheran Church was very strong, and that's a very different Protestant tradition. But in any case, this was a major challenge, to which the ruling New England Protestants responded successfully. To some extent, their hegemony, as we call it, was weakened, but only to some extent. What's remarkable, I think Glenn agrees with me, he's not allowed not to.
I agree with you, whatever you
That's
say.
what I just said that. The Protestant hegemony, which begins, it's hard to say when such a thing begins,
I
but
disagree with
yeah, really, but you're wrong. You're wrong. Let's say with the founding of maybe St. Anne's. Anybody know where they got the name St. Anne's? The church is actually now right here. Anyway, it's the wife of Joshua Sands was named Anne. And the church is named St. Anne's because of it. It's all right, right? It works. It's not a big deal. That was an Episcopal church, but maybe you should date the hegemonic character of Brooklyn's New England Protestants from the founding of the First Presbyterian in 1822. Well, it goes on for a very long time, well past the infusion of large numbers of Irish Catholics and German Catholics and Protestants who are different kinds of folks. This is handled fairly easily.
It's also handled, though we have to admit, through the exploitation of many of the Irish who were relatively powerless. And one of the things that you may or may not know about the 19th century and Brooklyn in particular is that when there was a cholera outbreak, for example, the statistics of the people who died were by ethnicity. When there were crimes, statistics by ethnicity, and the stereotypes that many of you know about Irish were visited in those statistics. And of course, Brooklyn, not at all in the way that Manhattan did, but Brooklyn had to deal with Irish upheaval, unhappiness during the draft riots of the Civil War period, and the antipathy between Irish and African Americans is visited on Brooklyn not to the the extent that it was in Manhattan, but it's certainly there. But as Stuart has said, the Protestants managed to retain control despite that first wave, but that changed dramatically with the second wave.
Yeah, and that second wave you're all familiar with, of course. Around the turn of the century, a little before the turn of the century, up to about World War I, the so-called new immigrants appeared, a huge wave, much larger wave of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Italian Catholics, Russian Jews, Polish Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, in much smaller numbers, by the way, those last two groups in Brooklyn. Many of whom, something like 13 million immigrants came to the United States during these years, most of them coming through the port of New York, many of them settling in New York, particularly in the Lower East Side, which became, most American historians claim, well, I've never seen the data on this, the most crowded acreage on the planet Earth. And it may have been. I don't know if they've studied Calcutta that closely, but in any case, very, very crowded. And of course, a breeding ground of pathologies of various kinds. You know, health, a lot of health issues and many other issues as well. I don't know if you've seen the cover of this book, but there's a bridge on it. All right? Anybody recognize the bridge? I know you can't see it from that distance, probably.
It's not the Brooklyn
It's not the Brooklyn Bridge. It's the Williamsburg Bridge, the Jews' Highway, the Passover Bridge.
It's called the Passover Bridge.
Which in Manhattan goes to Delancey Street, right? And served as a valve, an escape valve, at just the moment. This opened in December of 1903. In 1904 and 1905, a lot of the landlords, who, by the way, were very often members of the very ethnic groups that they were, immigrant groups they were renting to, raised their rents, notably, partly because of new tenement laws that New York was passing. They felt they had to raise their rents. So, you know, what's a reasonable person who's not making a whole lot of money to do? Well, you move. And where do they move? They move to Brooklyn in huge numbers. I mean, why was Glenn born in Brownsville? You know, he can discuss that later. So Brooklyn suddenly became far more diverse and much more rapidly. The increasing diversity of the 1840s and 50s was also very rapid, and the response was very notable. This was a lot bigger. Our book ends in 1930, entirely because we didn't need to go any further to establish the end of the Protestant hegemony and the emergence of that mosaic that Marcia mentioned, that mosaic of ethnic communities, all side by side, jostling against each other, not always all that peacefully, but in a way that differed dramatically from Brooklyn's prior history.
Yeah, and one of the things that we talk about is the lived experience of these immigrants. And the argument that we make in the book is that there was subsequently a theory of cultural pluralism, most associated with a man named Horace Callan, who criticized the melting pot and talked about cultural assimilation. Our argument is that the lived experience of these immigrants predated cultural pluralism and defined cultural pluralism, partly because of the sheer numbers of these immigrants. So we talk about the thick institutional framework that was built by these immigrants that wasn't nearly as true of their predecessors. For Jews, it wasn't true at all of German Jews, but it was true of the Orthodox Jews, not only building synagogues, but benevolent institutions and labor institutions of all kinds, and because the Jews were as numerous as they were, they could be bolder. So, for example, early on, Jews criticized, harshly criticized, public school practices of singing Christmas carols or of opening with prayers. And one of the things that's important, I think many of you may know this, but the Jewish immigrant experience was unique or relatively unique in this respect. When Jews came to America, they couldn't go back. 1/3 of Italian immigrants returned to Italy. Many German and Irish immigrants supported the homeland for a long time. For Jews, that was not really an option. Jews went to public schools. Many Catholics went to parochial schools. And so the so-called school wars were to a certain extent conducted by Jews. Jews, Orthodox Jews, had to close their shops on Saturdays. They certainly didn't want to also close their shops on Sundays. And so they had a special reason to fight against the Sabbatarian laws. And they did fight against the Sabbatarian laws. And we talk about fierce battles in the beginning of the 20th century over censorship of movies, over the first birth control clinic in America, which was in Brooklyn, in Brownsville. They fought against the suppression of that. They fought for Sunday baseball. They fought against a prohibition. They fought against immigration restriction, and they lost that battle. So the struggle is a struggle in which the numbers of immigrants prevailed, but the theory of cultural pluralism was embedded in America even before it was a theory.
And it should also be said, with regard to a lot of things we've already said about the prior history of Brooklyn, is all the things Glenn is talking about means that there was no hegemony following the demise of the New England Protestant hegemony. The New England Yankee Brooklyn was not replaced by Jewish Brooklyn or first Irish Brooklyn or German Brooklyn or Italian Brooklyn. There was no such thing. There was no hegemony. There was that mosaic, that congeries of ethnic communities and racial communities. So one of the reasons we deal with race in this book, I hope pretty powerfully. Well, we should note here that we end before Brooklyn has a very large increase in its black population. It's only about 2 or 3% in 1930. So that's why we're focusing on white ethnic groups. But all the things we are saying about white ethnic groups can be said about African Americans, many of whom are migrants from the South, but many also coming from the West Indies, very famously. And so that's yet another part of the mosaic that continues to infuse Brooklyn with a very different kind of character than what it had in the 19th century, when probably as much as or more than any other place manifested that post-Puritan, I'd like to call it, evangelical Protestant power. What a transformation it is, and it's an American transformation.
And in fact, toward the end of the book,
why am I looking over here?
toward the end of the book, we talk about the Protestants being outnumbered, how they resist, how they are resigned, and how much they flee. And we use, throughout the book, we use a lot of literature. And one of the things that we talk about that probably many of you know something about is the play and then the movie Arsenic and Old Lace. Do you know that it's set in Brooklyn? Do you know that the Brewster sisters are spinsters?
They trace their family back to the Mayflower, of course.
They have no children, and their nephew thinks he's Theodore Roosevelt. What's the relevance of Theodore Roosevelt? Theodore Roosevelt warned the Protestants against committing race suicide by not producing enough children to equal or surpass these immigrants. And what do the Brewster sisters do? They kill lonely Protestants, take them out of their misery in many respects. And it's a wonderful metaphor for the fall of Protestant Brooklyn. And then we also end by talking about what Brooklyn became and the ways in which cultural pluralism was embedded in the American creed.
It's kind of interesting. Some of you may have perked up your ears at Glenn's talking about Horace Callan's rejection of the idea of the melting pot. We often think of the melting pot as a kind of an accommodating idea. That is, okay, it's good to have immigrants because they will, all these different kinds of folks that we are will melt into a new kind of America. We'll all become Americans by the process of assimilating to each other, and so we'll maintain that unity that is called the American. And Horace Callan says, no, not so fast. This isn't happening anyway. Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, very much approved of Israel Zangwill's play, The Melting Pot, and it was dedicated to him. Horace Callan says, no, this isn't, not only is this not happening, and not only will it not happen, but he preferred and offered a different metaphor, the metaphor of the symphony orchestra. The symphony orchestra needs all of its different instruments. They don't meld into each other. They complement each other through their very differences. You know, the cellos are playing here, the bassoons are over there, the timpanists are back in the back there. And they're all necessary. And they're not going to, the timpanists are not going to become cellists. And that's a good thing, isn't it? The beauty of symphonic music is achieved through this simultaneous cooperation of very different instruments, each with its own timbre, its own role, its own line of music.
So I'm going to shock you now.
Oh my God!
Neither Stuart nor I is a Protestant. Some of you, I sensed, were guessing that. Some of you were. I don't think he's a Protestant.
So what gives
Margaret?
us leave? Yeah.
So this book for us did have a personal side. It's dedicated to our parents. One of the footnotes at the end describes our fathers. You want to?
Yeah, I like to read it. I can find it this time. Yeah, Glenn started by saying this book was very personal to us in many ways.
And so do you remember A Tree Grows in Brooklyn when the main character is asked in class, who's an American? So here's the footnote.
All right, so the little girl who's asked this, Francie, says, well, I'm an American. And you go through all this stuff. Well, no, where were your parents born? You know, well, they were born in America. But it goes on and on that way. Anyway, here's a footnote, and I have to tell you that this is okay now because, you know, Glenn and I are getting a little bit long in the tooth. And the historians are sort of not supposed to inject themselves into writing history. The hell
what
with
the
that.
hell?
The hell with it. You know, what can they do to us now? Take away our tenure? So this is very heartfelt, and I hope you appreciate it. I hope you don't mind it. So here's the footnote. Betty Smith at the Tree Grows in Brooklyn, blah, blah, blah. Both of our fathers had similar real-world experiences. Stuart's father was asked on his first day of school to stand and announce his name to the class. When he said, Pesha, the teacher insisted that he state his American name. Greatly flustered, and my father was a very shy man, by the way.
Just like you.
Yeah, like me, yeah, right. I'm like my mother. The little immigrant boy could think only of the name his father, Herschel, had adapted when he set up his tailoring shop. Harry, he announced. And so Harry he became in the American schoolroom that day. It's a little hard for me to read the rest. And Harry he remained for the next 80 years. I'm sorry, I loved my father. When Glenn's father arrived in the United States from Russia by way of China, an immigration official asked him his name. Grisha, he said. That's not an American name, the official declared. The 7-year-old boy managed in broken English to indicate that his Hebrew name was Tzvi Hersh. Let's give him Harry, the official said to his colleague. We've already given out a lot of Harrys, the other man said. Let's call him Herb. And so it was. These stories like this are repeated in American families by their millions.
Yes, and so we'd like to conclude before we open things up for questions by just reading how we decided to end the book.
Yeah, and I get to do all the good stuff, you know. I get to read this.
He's
So
older and he's bigger now.
I'm older, right? Yeah, I'm bigger, and
He tries to hurt me.
and I talk at least as much. No, I don't.
More.
No. Glenn is the one person who can out-talk me. Anyway, so this is the last paragraph. I promise you it's a short one, and I won't cry. No, it's okay, isn't it? It's okay, isn't it? Now, this is following on the discussion of Horace Callan, and in addition to that, our recitation of the arguments about replacement, the great replacement, the replacement theory, that tracks back to the 19-teens and 1920s. Madison Grant and a few other people writing about how horrible it is that the Nordic race is going to be replaced in part through race suicide and in part just through the amount of immigration that's flowing into this country from these unspeakable people, okay? Like much of us, many of us. Though fundamental to American identity, cultural pluralism, which in the 21st century has been supplemented and to some extent supplanted by the concept of multiculturalism, still contends with reassertions of xenophobia and white nationalism. You know what I mean. And with considerable resistance from people who do not accept the premise that cultural diversity not only defines America, but is one of its greatest strengths. Still, the lady who lifts her lamp beside the golden door knows the value of the wretched refuse of any teeming shore. And Brooklynites know that their uniquely vibrant borough, as much as or more than any other place in America, is where huddled masses learned to breathe free.
Thank you all.
I'm going to sell this as soon as I get back home.
Less a question, a comment. You end in 1930 and talk about the Protestant hegemony being over. But I remember the Sunday school parade into the 50s down Bedford Avenue in Flatbush, where I lived. It's not called Flatbush anymore. And doing school prayer into the 50s. And I know of one social institution, organization that accepted its first, that was restricted, accepted its first Catholic member either in 1964 or 1968. She's still alive. So it didn't end in the 30s. There were still vestiges of it.
Look, this is a very important point that you make, and we should make clear that the end of hegemony doesn't mean that all the phenomena associated with that hegemony disappear. They don't. And in fact, that's what we try to say at the end, that some of the, in our judgment, more objectionable aspects of the Protestant hegemony have not entirely disappeared. As you yourself are saying, religious prejudice hasn't disappeared, but let's be fair about that. Religious prejudice isn't limited to Protestants. Religious prejudice exists, alas, among all peoples. And what we tried to do, even though we're very serious historians, is to point the way toward a discussion of these issues and to understand what's in the American creed now. And one of the things we suggest is that the immigration restrictionists closed the door in the legislation of 1921 and 1924, but in some important respects, they were too late. Because we're here, and you're here, and we're not going anywhere, and that means that this is a contested issue. And I don't have to say more than that now in 2022. And while this book is well-documented history, it's also history that is infused with a desire to have people think about those issues.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering if in your survey of the Protestants in the 19th century, if you did any work breaking them down by class and by sect, that there are large differences between various Protestant sects. People do move back and forth, and then there is clearly, as this building demonstrates, a great difference in class among that group.
Yeah. You mind if I respond to that? Yeah, really, I already grabbed the mic, right? Yeah, that's a very astute observation and question. Class and gender are woven throughout this book, and what's kind of interesting, well, with regard to the question of class, is that even in and near the very beginning of the development of what we call Protestant Brooklyn, a number of different Protestant churches are founded, often with different traditions. The Dutch actually were about as Calvinist as the New England Puritans were. There was very little contact between them. In fact, the first Dutch church, which is right over here, generally hired New England English dominies to run their church. But there are many other churches. There were Baptist churches and Methodist churches that ordinarily were associated with less elite people than the people who founded the Presbyterian and Episcopal churches in their initial incarnations, both down on Sand Street and then migrating up here into Brooklyn Heights. What's really interested in us, what was a little surprising, was the extent to which those churches were not at war over their doctrinal differences. I mentioned the First Presbyterian Church as the most powerful institution in Brooklyn. In a lot of ways, the Methodist and Baptist churches not only cooperated, but in a sense took their cues from what was going on Cranberry Street. Something you ordinarily wouldn't expect to find. The Baptist Church, the Methodists were really not organized on Calvinist principles at all, although the American Methodist Church was more Calvinist than the original British Methodist Church of the Wesley brothers.
Yeah, and I would add to that that one of the stories of the 19th century in the United States is the relative... One of the stories of the 19th century in the United States is the relative decline of doctrinal differences among Protestants. So the New England Protestants did not have a difficult time in establishing a hegemony over issues that were shared among adherents of the other denominations. Class is, as you, I think, imply, separates people, but not always. And it sometimes unites them when the appeals can be those of identifying others. And so many Protestants saw immigrants as the foes, even though many reformers were saying, no, it's the capitalists who are the foes. But that view, although it was by no means absent in Brooklyn, and there were strikes and labor strife, and even violence at times, the larger set of realities in Brooklyn, at least in the domains that we described, were part of that Protestant hegemony. So it's a very important question. It's one, I will say, Stuart, who is much more careful than I am, he wanted to have about 27 pages on the doctrinal differences between people, and I finally put my foot down and said, we didn't know you, but we said that we want to have enough to explain what we're doing, and sometimes you lose people when you talk a little bit too much about those differences, even in churches.
Give me that. Yeah, I'm sure, well, just he's not wrong. And I want to talk about gender for a second, too, because you asked about that. But with regard to the class dimensions of Protestantism, both in its unified mission and in its doctrinal differences. What's interesting to know, I know you all have Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism on your night table, and it is actually a pretty good read. There is no contradiction between the amassing of wealth and Protestant and Puritan piety. On the contrary, success in the world is a sign of God's approbation and of grace.
And we talk about that.
Yeah, we do a little bit. We don't belabor it, thank goodness. Not enough for me. But well, there's a good footnote here which describes the Synod of Dort and the 5 doctrines that come out, which you can use the wonderfully Dutch acronym TULIP. So it's very easy to remember. Read that footnote.
It was originally chapter 3.
Yeah, right. Right. He's very cruel. Anyway, so the
Are you waving hello, or do you have a question?
Yeah, you want me to shut up at this point? Yeah, okay. All right, let's leave that on. As for gender, women were very powerful in every one of these denominations. And in no small measure because of what Glenn was talking about. During the week, the guys weren't there.
They ran the place.
So during the week, they ran a lot of what the church was doing during the week, which was quite a bit. So, yeah, I could go on, as you already can see, for a very long period of time, and I better not.
Yeah, well,
So
I've got a little bit of the floor here, and I wanted to speak as a historian and a history teacher, that you both are good at it. And also, the presider over the timeline and history section of the website of the New England Society in the city of Brooklyn, founded in 1880, and with an original membership, which you may imagine. And this was really, really good. And I want to say, you've even taught me something I didn't know. I know. And you kept your sense of humor about it. This is really the most important issue in sociology, and only historians deal with it. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
And I just mentioned that that foundation of the New England Society of Brooklyn was the second incarnation of that. There was an earlier one founded out of the original New England Society of New York, which served alcohol at their annual dinner and created a great rebellion among the Brooklyn residing members who came here and founded the original Brooklyn Society of New England. And the Dutch responded a couple years later. The Dutch, by the way, which we've neglected very badly, because the Dutch were mainly located and quite influential in that distant rural community called Flatbush, which was not absorbed into Brooklyn until 1894, I think, just a couple of years before all of Kings County was absorbed into greater New York.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, at least one. Come on.
This is a comment, not a question. So if someone has a real question, it counts. Okay. I was born in Brooklyn, but I live in Manhattan. And my specialty of study is the consolidation of greater New York.
All right.
And so I have encountered this issue in my research. And I often have to explain to people this friction between the Brooklyn Protestant gentry and those folks who are trying to consolidate the city. And one illustration I use to tell people about how the Brooklyn gentry looked eastward to Long Island and New England, their Yankee forebears, as their future hinterland, and not across the East River, is by using this building. Etched in stone above the doorway to this building, it reads, the Long Island Historical Society, not the Brooklyn Historical Society. And it gives you some idea of where their vision was faced.
So one just a very astute point. Let me just mention that the president of the Long Island Historical Society for a long period of time was Richard Salter Storrs, the minister of the second most prominent church, the Church of the Pilgrims in Brooklyn. I would also mention something that you know, but maybe some others here don't know. When the vote on consolidation came, only one place was the vote close, and that was Brooklyn. And it was very close, 200 votes. And one of the reasons that it was so close is some of the ministers, including Richard Salter Storrs, who Stuart and I admired tremendously as we learned about him, said something that we didn't admire, and that is, if there is consolidation, Brooklyn is going to be overrun by immigrants.
By the sewage of Europe.
By the sewage of Europe.
This was the most respected clergyman in Brooklyn, even including a man who we somehow have not mentioned, Henry Ward Beecher. How did we get this far?
Yes.
Without saying Henry Ward Beecher?
Yes. So thank you all again for coming and for these terrific comments and questions.
And I want to thank you all, too, and say Professors Altschuler and Blumin are going to go downstairs, and you can continue asking questions down there, but please let them get to the table. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you.